Hello, Modern here. Today with an updated Trampleslide build guide. Previously I named this one the Croneslide build, but since then I optimized it to the highest possible degree with the most optimized Paragon setup, skill setup and aspect setup, as well as gear affixes, and I dropped the Crone staff in favor of a one-hand weapon and a totem. Now this makes gearing a little bit harder, but the rewards for this are millions and millions of damage and DPS. Now Landslide might not always hit for millions, but if you add up all the instances of damage at 600k plus, you're going to have a decent sum of damage. You have great defenses that make it possible to run into enemies without getting one-shot. You have the DPS and damage to down elite enemies, even with juiced mods. And all this is possible at 94. I'm not even max level for this. The max level version will include more damage reductions, which makes it possible to clear even higher ones. As for the basic mechanics of this build, we are going to utilize the Nature's Fury keystone with Symbiotic as an aspect. Every time the Nature's Fury procs, we are going to get a reduction on cooldowns. But only relying on that one reduction is not going to cut it in higher difficulties. We are also going to use Pack Leader to poison creeper our enemies all the time. We are going to deal a lot of critical strikes, which makes it possible to reset your poison creeper instantly, so you can immobilize enemies on repeat. This will generate terror modes, which will generate critical strikes with your landslides. Whenever we trample, we summon a bunch of them. But we can also hardcast this ability. This makes it possible to have a very nice clearing ability with our Trampleslide and very good pinpoint accurate single target burst damage with our hardcast landslides. Our basic ability is going to be the Storm Strike ability. This one gives us damage reduction whenever we use it, but we can also proc Nature's Fury with it. Usually this ability is very slow, but you can circumvent this with modifiers on your totem to basic attack speed, on your helmet the same, and on your gloves with another attack speed modifier. This also lets us omit the basic attack speed aspect in favor of a more multiplier for our earth damage. The next ability is Cyclon armor. Cyclon armor is here to knock back enemies. You might think it is disadvantageous to knock back enemies, but in high difficulties you don't want enemies to swarm you. Having a button to knock back enemies is a great option to have on a build. And the biggest benefit is you are making enemies vulnerable. When you now Trampleslide through them, you're not knocking them back. They're staying in the Trampleslide, which makes them prime targets for landslides to knock them out. And our last ability, which enables us to tackle nightmare dungeons at high difficulties, is Earthen Bulwark. Now Earthen Bulwark is boosted by a lot of things here. We're going to generate a ton of barrier every few seconds, and we reset the cooldown of this one with Nature's Fury procs. This leads to a very high uptime on it, basically doubling our health pool. Now whenever this ability expires, it's also going to deal a ton of damage. The explosion of this one scales with the barrier amount, as well as all your modifiers to earthen crit damage, and other modifiers that increase the damage. Let's go into the basic rotation and how you want to play this build. At lower difficulties, you can just trample into enemies, poison creeper them, trample to the next one. You want to weave in your storm strikes in between, as well as all your other abilities. This will make sure you constantly reset your trample and can trample through the whole dungeon. However, in high nightmare difficulties, you're not going to want to do this. You want to wait for your Earthen Bulwark to come up. This is the benefit of you not getting one shot. And whenever the barrier expires and gets deleted, you're going to make them explode into a multi-million hit. Larger packs of elite enemies are also not a problem with this build. Tramplesliding them into position by knocking them back into walls and stunning them makes them perfect targets for your hardcast landslides. Those will deal extra damage since they are targeting crowd-controlled enemies. And the waves of landslides will also hit our target. And our bulwark will also most probably going to explode right when we try to burst the target. This way we are going to utilize all tools available to us. Next I want to briefly talk about Cyclone armor versus Hurricane. Now Hurricane has a better modifier to our defenses, with a 20% less damage taken from enemies that are affected by it. On paper I would prefer Hurricane. However, I think the knockback from our Cyclone armor as well as the guaranteed vulnerability window we can apply to bosses and elite enemies is a much stronger option on this build. For Hurricane we have to choose between the vulnerability, which has only a slight chance to proc on every tick, or a 20% less damage taken from enemies affected by it. We also need to be in close range for it to affect those enemies. Cyclone armor doesn't have this restriction. If something off-screens us with a fire ability for example, we are going to mitigate the damage regardless. So I prefer Cyclone armor on this build. For the next section, I'm going to go over the gear I have been using and the aspects I have currently on my character. First, I will go briefly over the Crone staff. Now my Crone staff has a high item level already. I also have a nearly max Stormstrike roll here, so it's a pretty good option for this build. However, it falls off towards later Nightmare dungeons. This has a simple reason. We are sacrificing a lot of modifiers on the weapon itself with no vulnerability, crit damage or willpower. We are also not using any aspects that benefit the build. When we look at a one-hand option plus offhand, a totem, we're going to see two very nice aspects to have. Now those aspects can be put on your gauntlets, on your ring or weapon, doesn't matter. Only the amulet is getting a bonus, and this one is reserved for Trampleslide. Now the additional modifiers, for example, that we can get on this build are the Natural Balance one, the Crash Stone one, and the Conceited one. Now let's go over those three first before I talk about the others. Crash Stone increases the critical damage enemies take from us by up to 40% when they are crowd controlled. This is a multiplier. If you have 1000 critical strike damage, this one is multiplied by the 40%, so it's actually 1400. This makes this aspect exceptionally strong. But there is another one that doesn't specify its more multiplier despite it being one. The Natural Balance one. This one can roll up to 45% and is the only condition that we use a storm skill before it. And we get this one for 4 seconds. So this one is strictly stronger than the Crash Stone one. And we want to use this one whenever we can. For our offhand, I'm going to choose the Conceited one. Now this one increases with a more multiplier the damage we deal whenever we have a barrier. Since we have quite a good uptime on our barrier through Earthen Bulwark and the resets we get through Nature's Fury, we're going to have this buff up all the time. That's 25% more damage. Now the other option is the Edge Master. This one deals up to 20% increased damage or a more multiplier whenever we have our primary resource at full. But this one has a drawback. We cannot use our Landslide's Hardcast ability since we are losing damage by doing so. With the barrier one we can just activate our Earthen Bulwark, run into enemies, stun them or immobilize them, and we get the bonus. We can burst down targets more efficiently. Now as for the ring, this one also has a more multiplier while we have a Fortify up. Now the more Fortify we have, the better this one is. This build has near constant uptime at 100% Fortify, so we get a 40% more multiplier on our core skill abilities. That's very important to note. Now Trample is not one, but the landslides that are procced by the Trampled Earth legendary aspect are considered landslides. The keyword is highlighted here. Going over this one, we are also going to note two things. First, this one is affected by ranks to Earthslide. So when we look at our gloves, we have +3 ranks. This one is missing 1, so it's not perfect, but I'm currently rolling for it. It's going to affect the damage of those landslides, but only and only if you have it on your bar. Is it going to proc the terror modes we have with landslides? The damage is going to be affected regardless, even if we don't have this one on the bar. I tested this one a lot, but the terror modes do not spawn. The counter is on the ability, so it's not working if the ability is not in the bar. This is not true for all abilities, by the way. If we don't have Stormstrike on our bar, it doesn't have a counter, an active counter for the terror modes. It's still going to apply vulnerable and immobilize, despite it not being on a bar, if we use the Crone staff, for example. Now the next aspect we are going to use is the landslide one that doubles the landslide damage. When we use a landslide, so when we trample, it repeats the wave. This wave is going to deal a little bit more damage. It's a 12% more multiplier per hit, which is a substantial upgrade in power. It basically more than doubles our damage. On our helmet we are going to rock the Nature's Fury aspect. This one is going to reduce the non-ultimate cooldowns of us by up to 8 seconds whenever we proc this one. Something to note here is that Nature's Fury wants you to use your ability and cast it. It doesn't require you to hit an enemy. Meaning if you are standing outside the pack, you can just spam your Storm Strike or Claw, depending on if you are using Crone or not, and this will reset your abilities, because you are casting the ability. As for the defensive options, we are going with the Earthguard Primal Breastplate here. This one has the modifier that whenever we see an enemy, our next Earthen Bulwark is going to be more effective, up to 100%. But this one seems to only affect the base value of the ability. Meaning if we have an Earthen Bulwark at rank 8, like here, it's not going to affect the rank 8 one, but only the rank 1. So it's not going to double this one to over 9k, but only to around 6k. I am not sure if this one is a bug or intended feature, but it works like this. The next aspect is going to be either disobedience or the aspect of might. Now, depending on your gear setup, one is better than the other. The more damage reductions you have, the less likely it is that aspect of might is going to outperform the armor. Each reduction in damage is going to be multiplicative to each other. If you get 20% more on another source, it's going to be less effective than just the total armor increase you get, making disobedience better with more damage reductions. But you have to keep in mind, enemies at higher levels, at higher nightmare difficulties, are going to outscale you in levels, making armor less effective the higher you go. So damage reductions are key at higher difficulties. And for the last aspect, we are going to go with Ghost Walker on our boots. Since we are trampling, we are unstoppable all the time, so we get this boost, and the 4 seconds afterwards, we are also getting the boost. We also move freely through enemies, which is nice to have when you maneuver outside of the enemy lines and there are stray enemies, and waiting for or fishing for your cooldowns. It is also constantly up while we have Earthen Bulwark. Now, as for the gems, as for the weapons, we want the Emerald ones at Royal Quality, so the one you get at the gym vendor. For your armor, you want the Sapphire ones. Those give 3% damage reduction while fortified, so we can get 15% through those. And for your jewelry, you want the Skull ones. You can also get some consumables, like for example, the Elixir of Savagery for more critical strike damage, but there is also Iron Barb elixirs that give 400 armor. This will benefit you greatly for your damage reduction. Next, I want to go over the stats on the gear. So for the helmet, we want the Life on Kill modifier. This one is important for the build since we are lacking a bit in the sustain department. We are all about damage mitigation, but recovery of life is also important. Next, we want intelligence. The intelligence roll on here is not optimal. I would much prefer a life roll, a max life roll that's up to 1300 life, which increases our survivability immensely. The cooldown reduction and the basic attack speed, however, are mandatory. We are not going to use any aspects that increase our basic attack speed, so we want to get as much as possible on our gear. For the armor, go for as much damage reduction as possible. This includes damage reduction from distant enemies, damage reduction from close enemies, damage reduction from fortified, and flat damage reduction. All of those are in a separate bucket and going to reduce the damage you take. The total armor one here is nice to have, especially early on at nightmare difficulties that are close to your level, but will fall off greatly later on. A life modifier can also be beneficial here if you do not have 2 on your gear, but the second one should go on your rings. As for your gloves, go for ranks to landslide, which benefit our damage. We want as much attack speed and crit strike chance as possible, and the last one can be a stat of your choice, be it willpower, intelligence, or dexterity depending on your Paragon board. You should, however, get enough dexterity from the board, so you don't need dexterity on your gear. So willpower and intelligence is the one you should prefer. As for your pants, go for one that gives you the barrier on potion use. It is a nice survivability boost and the movement speed is not that great. Otherwise, you want as much damage reduction as possible. I do not have better pants than this, so the ranks to Hurricane should be damage versus closer enemies. As for the boots, go for movement speed, intelligence, willpower, and the last one should be the one that gives you movement speed on elite kills. As for the base, I prefer to have more evade charges, since you want to maneuver as fast as possible around enemies. The one that gives you more movement speed is not going to benefit us that much, only early on, but later on it's not that useful. And the one that decreases the cooldown whenever you hit an enemy with an attack is nice to have, but I prefer to have our charges stacked up in a bunch of little bursts. For the amulet you have multiple options. The movement speed and cooldown are mandatory, but the ranks to wild impulses are not. You can also go with ranks to envenom. The most damage you can get on this one is through getting wild impulses to rank 3 and ranks to envenom to rank 3. However, it is very unlikely to roll both, so the next best option is ranks to all defensive skills. This gives us a little bit more survivability through Earthen Bulwark and Cyclon armor. As for the rings, we want Earth crit damage, crit chance, and vulnerable damage. This one has damage to injured enemies, which is not that beneficial to the build. You should also consider getting a life roll on this one. However, in this case, you want crit strike chance, life, crit damage flat, not the earth one, and vulnerable damage. The other ring is perfect. It has crit strike chance, crit strike damage, earth crit strike damage, and vulnerable damage. As for your weapon, go for as much crit strike damage as possible. Try to get a good willpower roll and improve your core skill damage. This one is affecting your landslides that are procced by a trample. And for your totem, this one is pretty much garbage for me right now. I don't have a better one. So this one just had the highest item power and crit strike chance. But you can get cooldown reduction on this one, which will be enormous for this build, especially since we do not have our symbiotic aspect on our amulet. You can get crit strike chance on here. You can get damage reduction versus fortified. You can get willpower on this one. And you can get life on kill on this one. There is a few other options, but I have them included in the MAXROLL talent planner. Now for those of you that have noticed, I do not have any gems in those weapons. Those are in here. I only have 2 of them. I am lazy and didn't craft more. So it's the emerald ones. Now let's go over the spirit boons. As for the spirit boons, we want wariness for the deer. That reduces the damage we take from elites. We want avian wrath. Now this one is a weird one. We are not entirely sure if this one is a multiplier. It has an X here, so it may be multiplying the critical strike damage we deal. But if it's not, it is strictly better to go with swooping strike, since this was a 10% attack speed modifier. I personally have been experimenting with both, and I have not noticed much of a difference with avian wrath. So I'm nearly 100% certain avian wrath is only an additive modifier. So the more crit damage you have, the less likely it is you want to pick this. And swooping attacks is better. For the next cluster, the wolf cluster, we want 2 boons. The first one is bolster, which gives us fortify based on our maximum life for our defensive skills. So whenever we use our earthen bulwark or our cyclone armor, we are getting a 10% fortify boost. The second one is pack leader. We're going to critically strike a ton. So this one is going to reset our poison creeper, which will generate our terror mods for our landslide, which in turn will generate more critical strikes. So it's a feedback loop that is very nice to build around. And for the last one, the snake, there is only one that's really good. The obsidian slam one, we are stacking a bit of willpower, so overpower is getting a boost. We are stacking fortify, and we have a little bit of life, so this one is going to boost our damage and lets us reach probably 3 million damage with our landslides. So the other options are just lackluster. I have been experimenting with masochistic. Whenever we trample for enemies, we are going to crit sometimes, so this one is going to regenerate our health. It is kind of okay, but I prefer the obsidian slam one. Next, I want to go over the abilities. We are going to start with Storm Strike. Storm Strike is going to be used to fish for our procs with Nature's Fury. So this one has the Fierce Storm Strike, so we have a better vulnerable uptime on bosses and elite enemies. We then go to the Landslide one. We want as many ranks in Landslide as possible, since this one is going to boost our damage. We want to pick Primal Landslide for more Terror mods. The Terror mods guarantee our Landslide to critically strike. Whenever we mobilize or stun an enemy, we get terror mods, and bosses have a 10% chance to generate a terror mod when we hit them. So this one is great versus bosses and very good versus groups of enemies. We then pick Wild Impulses, 3 ranks here. I have 3 on my amulet, so we have 6 in total, resulting in 30% more damage. Iron Fur is here for damage reduction. Damage reduction is important to high go in nightmare dungeons, so I picked this one to increase our survivability. In the next cluster, we have the same with Vigilance. Vigilance has nearly 100% uptime since we are spamming Bulwark and Cyclone armor. For Bulwark, go for as many ranks as possible. This will boost the barrier you have. We want Innate Earthen Bulwark. This one is the one that deals damage. So when our Earthen Bulwark expires or gets renewed, it's going to deal the damage. Cyclone armor, pick Innate Cyclone armor for the vulnerability. I have only 1 rank in this one since we are getting 3 ranks from our amulet. This one is at 4, so we don't want to use more than just 1 rank in this one. For the Poison Creeper, we only have 1 rank in this, and we pick Brutal Poison Creeper. This increases our crit strike chance by 20%. Now, this might sound like it's bad since we are using Terror mode, but we don't have 100% Terror mode uptime, especially versus single target enemies, so having 20% critical strike chance is quite good. In the next cluster, we are going to max Crushing Earth. So this one gives us a 15% more damage multiplier versus slowed, stunned, immobilized or knocked back targets. And Stone Guard, whenever we have 50% fortify or more, we deal 12% more damage with our earth skills. So that's also great. And to generate a lot of fortify, we also need Safeguard. You can skip this one and go for 1 additional point in Iron Fur, but I personally prefer to have Safeguard since I want more consistency with our fortify. Whenever I get hit and deplete our fortify, I can get it back quite fast with this one. For Trample, we are going to Fortify path. So the natural Trample is going to give us 20% Fortify whenever we trample. And we are also going to pick Envenom. Envenom is a more multiplier to the crit strike damage, just as Stone Crush. This means 1000 crit is going to turn into 1300 crit. In the next cluster, we want Defiance, we want Natural Disaster, and we want Resonance. All of those will buff our damage considerably. And then we have Nature's Fury. Nature's Fury is proccing whenever we cast a Storm skill or an Earth skill. Next, let's go over the Paragon Board. We're going to start with Exploit in the starter cluster. This one gets the most benefit and we can get access to this very early. And this will be a nice multiplier to the burst damage we deal. In the next board, we are going to go for the Spirit Glyph. This one is going to give us critical strike damage with core abilities. Our landslide pillars that we proc through trample are considered core skills. So this one is affecting our damage. This one will also increase the damage enemies take from us by up to 12% based on the critical strikes we deal to them. Since we are critically striking them all the time, we're going to benefit from this multiplier. For endgame, we want to fill out all those clusters to get more dexterity, maximum life, and natural magic skill damage. For this part of the tree, the devastation one gives us quite a bit of increases to our damage. It's nearly 40%, so we want to have this. This board is the constricting tendrils one. The next board is going to be Inner Beast. Inner Beast gives us access to attack speed on the left side, which is 5% in the nibble node and 1.3% in 3 other nodes, so quite considerable. We can path through the top, which is a 30% crit strike damage node with 10% physical damage and a few nodes with 7.5 crit strike damage. The physical damage is affecting our earth skills, since Landslide, Trample, and even Cyclone, all of them are physical damage, so it's buffing us. So those are great for damage. And all of those also give us access to additional Paragon Boards. But first, we are going to path to this glyph. This glyph is very important. It is a massive increase to our damage. Whenever we are fortified, we deal 100% increased damage. We also get damage reduction because of the intelligence we pick. The rare node left of it is basically useless for our build, so we don't pick it. Then there is Determination. Determination gives us 200 armor, which is not that bad. It translates to around 3% damage reduction. And it is right next to an intelligence node. Next, we are going to finish pathing up north, which enables us to grab the Urban Devastation board. Path through here to get the Outmatched Glyph. This one increases the bonus from all rare nodes. This means our rare node, Earthen Power, that increases the critical strike damage of our Earth skills, is getting a massive boost. We are also getting a lot of critical strike damage with Earth skills around this node. The intelligence around here is not necessary, so we don't pick it. Unlocking Outmatched bonus is a 16% physical damage boost to non-elites and bosses. A massive boost to our damage. We then path north to grab Urban Devastation. Urban Devastation gives us a 30% increase to our damage versus crowd-controlled targets. So basically another more multiplier. We pick up Oppress on the right side. This gives us a bunch of critical strike damage versus crowd-controlled enemies and an increased damage versus crowd-controlled enemies. And then we unlock our next board. Now we only unlock this board. This will make sure we can pick up Bulwark with just the willpower on our gear. Instead, we are going to go down and pick Heightened Malice. Heightened Malice increases the damage we deal by 45% when 3 or more targets are poisoned. Since our poison creeper is going to hit 3 targets at least, we're going to get this bonus nearly all the time except for single target or dual target damage. We then path north and get access to Bulwark as well as the Survival Instinct node. Now Survival Instinct is only going to affect our werebear form, but it's stated it's while we are in the werebear form. If we cast our Landslide pillars, we cast our Bulwark, and we then trample and stay in this werebear form, all of those abilities are going to be affected by the more damage multiplier, meaning we get a massive execute. And for the last board, with the last points, we're going to path to this side. This will give us access to Thunderstruck. We want to attach this one at this side, with the Hubris node facing north. We path to this one, get the glyph slot, and get Earth and Sky. Earth and Sky will affect the magic nodes here and give us a bonus to them, resulting in a 5% damage reduction to vulnerable enemies. With 3 nodes, that's 15%, and we get 4 additional here, so that's 19%. And we get 10% more damage through this node. To show you the glyph, this is the one. So Earth and Sky goes into the Thunderstruck board. You can find the talent planner down below with all the details with the finished Paragon Board. This one is optimized for high nightmare dungeons, so I'm getting as much damage reduction as possible. The only I'm not getting is down here, the damage reduction to poisoned enemies, but I just don't think it's worth pathing to this one. Anyway, this sums up the build guide. This is the best Trampleslide build you will ever see. There is not much else I can optimize for this one. It gets nearly all the multipliers except for Ancestral Guidance. We can possibly fit this one into this build, but I don't think it's worth it. And that's about it. My gear is not optimal, but with optimal gear, this one can constantly hit in the million range. And a lot of damage reduction and so on and so forth. So if you like this video, make sure to leave a comment, like and subscribe. See you next time and bye.